as if, really, there were no war on terror and no war in Iraq ongoing at all.
So it is, you're right. 7 years into its confrontation with radical Islam, the United States finds itself with too much war for too few warriors, and with no prospect of producing the additional soldiers needed to close the gap. When I hear all this talk about increasing the troops in Afghanistan from 2 to 3 battalions, maybe even more, I keep asking myself, where are we going to get those troops?
Well, and of course the answer is they have to come from Iraq. I mean, as we speak, the security conditions in Iraq have improved a little bit, and in a sense it's just in time, because what the Pentagon wants to do is to draw down its presence in Iraq to some degree, not in order to give those troops a breather, but in order to redeploy them after a period of retraining to Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is going so poorly. So we're having a very difficult time managing two wars which in a 20th century context are actually relatively small.
You say U.S. troops in battle dress and body armor, whom Americans profess to admire and support, pay the price for the nation's refusal to confront our domestic dysfunction. What are we not confronting?
The most obvious, the blindingly obvious question is energy. It's oil. I think historians 100 years from now will puzzle over how it could be that the United States of America, the most powerful nation in the world, as far back as the early 1970s, came to recognize that dependence on foreign oil was a problem, posed a threat, compromised our freedom of action. How every president from Richard Nixon down to the present one, President Bush, declared, we're going to fix this problem. None of them did. And the reason we are in Iraq today is because the Persian Gulf is at the center of the world's oil reserves. I don't mean that we invaded Iraq on behalf of big oil, but the Persian Gulf region would have zero strategic significance were it not for the fact that that's where the oil is. Back in 1980, I think President Carter, in many respects, when he declared the Carter Doctrine and said that henceforth the Persian Gulf had enormous strategic significance to the United States, and the United States was not going to permit any other country to control that region of the world. And that set in motion a set of actions that has produced the militarization of U.S. policy, ever deeper U.S. military involvement in the region, and in essence has postponed that day of reckoning when we need to understand the imperative of having an energy policy and trying to restore some semblance of energy independence.
And this is connected, as you say in the book in your first chapter, to what you call the crisis of profligacy.
Well, we don't live within our means. I mean, the nation doesn't, and increasingly individual Americans don't. The individual savings rate in this country is below zero. The personal debt, national debt, however you want to measure it, as individuals and as a government and as a nation, we assume an endless line of credit. As individuals, the line of credit is not endless. That's one of the reasons why we're having this current problem with the housing crisis and so on. And my view would be that the nation's assumption that its line of credit is endless is also going to be shown to be false. And when that day occurs, it's going to be a black day indeed.
You call us an empire of consumption.
I didn't create that phrase. It's a phrase drawn from a book by a wonderful historian at Harvard University, Charles Moyers, and the point he makes in his very important book is that if we think of the United States at the apex of American power, which I would say would be the immediate post-World War II period, through the Eisenhower years, into the Kennedy years, we made what the world wanted. They wanted our cars. We exported our television sets, our refrigerators. we were the world's manufacturing base. He called it an empire of production.
Right.
Sometime around the 1960s, there was a tipping point when the empire of production began to become the empire of consumption, when the cars started to be produced elsewhere, and the television sets, and the socks, and everything else. And what we ended up with was the American people becoming consumers rather than producers.
And you say this has produced a condition of profound dependency to the extent, and I'm quoting you, Americans are no longer masters of their own fate.
Well, they're not. I think that the current debt to the Chinese government grows day by day. Why? Well, because the negative trade balance. Our negative trade balance with the world is something in the order of $800 billion per year. That's $800 billion of stuff that we buy so that we can consume, that is $800 billion greater than the amount of stuff that we sell to them. That's a big number. I mean, it's a big number even relative to the size of our economy.
And you use this metaphor that is intriguing. American policymakers, quote, have been engaged in a de facto Ponzi scheme intended to extend indefinitely the American line of credit. What's going on that resembles a Ponzi scheme?
This continuing tendency to borrow and to assume that the bills are never going to come due. I testified before a House committee 6 weeks ago now on the future of U.S. of grand strategy. I was struck by the questions coming from members that showed an awareness, a sensitivity, and a deep concern about some of the issues that I try to raise in the book. How are we going to pay the bills? How are we going to pay for the commitment of entitlements that is going to increase year by year for the next couple of decades, especially as baby boomers retire? Nobody has answers to those questions. So I was pleased that these members of Congress understood the problem. I was absolutely taken aback when they said, "Professor, what can we do about this?" And their candid admission that they didn't have any answers, that they were perplexed, that this problem of learning to live within our means seemed to have no politically plausible solution.
You say in here that the tipping point between wanting more than we were willing to pay for began in the Johnson administration. We can fix the tipping point with precision, you write. It occurred between 1965, when President Lyndon Baines Johnson ordered U.S. combat troops to South Vietnam, and 1973, when President Richard Nixon finally ended direct U.S. involvement in that war. Why do you see that period so crucial?
When President Johnson became president, our trade balance was in the black. By the time we get to the Nixon era, it's in the red. And it stays in the red down to the present. As a matter of fact, the trade imbalance becomes essentially larger year by year. So I think that it is the 60s generally, the Vietnam period, slightly more specifically, was the moment when we began to lose control of our economic fate. And I guess most disturbingly, we're still really in denial. We still haven't recognized that.
Yeah, you go on to say that there was another fateful period between July 1979 and March of 1983. You describe it, in fact, as the pivot of contemporary American history. That includes Jimmy